Somewhere along the humid riverbanks of southern Mississippi, in the blistering summer of 1872, 11 men died in their beds. Not from yellow fever, not from consumption. Each one had his throat opened with surgical precision while he slept. Their bodies were discovered at dawn, their faces frozen between ecstasy and terror. All 11 were prominent members of the Knights of the White Magnolia, the most feared Klan chapter in the Deep South. Local authorities recorded the deaths as unrelated incidents scattered across 3 counties, their reports contradicting witnesses and physical evidence alike. Within 6 months, the case was quietly closed, the records sealed by order of the circuit judge. But in the colored quarters, in the back pews of freedmen's churches, another story took shape. One whispered for generations, never written down, never spoken aloud where white ears could hear. Tonight, that story can finally be told. Before we continue with the story of the woman they called La Veuve Noire, the Black Widow, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, stories that powerful men tried to bury, these are the truths we uncover on this channel. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Are you in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia? I want to know where our community is watching these forgotten histories come alive again. The story begins not in 1872, but 4 years earlier, in the ashes of a war that had supposedly ended. Lincoln County, Mississippi, 1868, a wound that refused to heal. The once mighty plantations that had produced cotton by the ton now stood like skeletons against a sky heavy with heat and rot. Their fields had turned back to scrub and mud. Their manor houses sagged under the weight of their own decayed grandeur. The small town of Brookhaven served as the county seat, a scattering of weathered buildings huddled around a courthouse that had changed flags 3 times in 7 years. The population had shifted in ways that terrified the old planter class. Nearly 4,000 freedmen now walked openly through streets where they'd once been forbidden even to make eye contact. Some owned property. Some voted under the watchful eyes of Union troops and the Freedmen's Bureau. Some testified in court against white defendants, an inversion of the old order so profound that many planters whispered it was the end of civilization itself. In response, the Knights of the White Magnolia had risen from the remnants of Confederate veterans groups and county militias. Unlike their more famous counterparts elsewhere, the Mississippi Knights prided themselves on a sinister sophistication. They wore no hoods, burned no crosses. They were lawyers, bankers, and plantation heirs, men who wielded power in courtrooms and banks rather than on horseback. Their tactics were quiet, almost surgical. A freedman who spoke too boldly might find his crops trampled, his mule poisoned, his credit suddenly revoked. A colored man who tried to register to vote might receive a late-night visit from well-dressed men offering friendly advice. Violence was reserved for those who refused to be intimidated, and even then it was precise, deliberate, and designed to send a message. The Knights met every Thursday night in the back room of the Brookhaven Hotel, a 2-story building on Main Street owned by Henry Jessup, one of their founding members. 11 men formed the inner circle, the ones who decided who needed to be reminded of their place, who Union loyalists needed encouragement to leave town, and which freedmen leaders had grown too bold for their own good. Into this quiet powder keg walked a woman who called herself Celeste Duval. She arrived in Brookhaven one April morning aboard a steamboat from Vicksburg, carrying a single trunk and a black silk parasol. She looked to be about 30, though something about her made age feel irrelevant, neither young nor old, but suspended somewhere beyond time. Her skin was the color of café au lait, an ambiguous shade that could signal Creole gentility, mixed heritage, or both. Her clothes were mourning black, tailored and elegant, suggesting wealth and refinement. She rented a suite at the Brookhaven Hotel, paying for an entire month up front with gold coins she counted out one by one onto Henry Jessup's counter. Her French was perfect. Her English bore a faint Parisian accent that mesmerized the locals. She claimed to be the widow of a French trader who had died during the yellow fever outbreak in New Orleans the last summer. Now, she said, she wanted a quiet home in the countryside, somewhere safe from disease and the chaos of the city. The story was plausible enough. Many widows had fled New Orleans after the epidemic, and there was something about Celeste Duval that discouraged questions, an aura of self-possession that demanded respect. She attended Mass every Sunday at St. Mary's, sitting among the pews reserved for Creole families. She took her meals alone, reading French novels or writing letters in an immaculate hand. By the end of her second week in town, she had caught the attention of every man on the Knights Council. It began innocently enough. Thomas Broussard, who owned 1,200 acres of struggling cotton fields, met her outside the general store one afternoon. She was inspecting a bolt of silk, her gloved hands tracing its texture. He offered his help, claiming he knew the merchant personally. She smiled, a small, knowing smile that made him feel both important and slightly ridiculous. They talked briefly. She spoke of her late husband, of searching for a peaceful home, of being a stranger in a troubled land. By nightfall, Broussard couldn't get her out of his mind. There was something magnetic about her, not merely beauty, but intensity. When she looked at you, you felt seen in a way that was almost unbearable. Soon Broussard found excuses to linger in the hotel lobby. He offered to escort her to properties she might wish to buy. She accepted, always proper, always polite. He told his wife he was merely helping a widow, but when he lay awake at night, he thought of her perfume, the way candlelight curved across her throat. The others noticed his distraction. Within weeks, more of them were drawn in. Anthony Laird, the lawyer, Dr. Raymond Hebert, the town physician, Eugene Fontenot, who owned a general store, all found reasons to call upon Madame Duval. Each man came away certain she favored him alone. Each imagined himself her confidant, her savior, her temptation. By June, the Thursday meetings of the Knights had grown strained. The men, once united by purpose, now circled each other warily, trading quiet boasts about who had captured Celeste's interest. None of them noticed that she had yet to purchase a single property, or that every night, behind her locked hotel room door, Celeste wrote in a small leather-bound journal. In that journal, she recorded each man's habits, his weaknesses, his sins. She listed where they lived, who guarded their houses, whether their wives slept soundly, whether they kept guns within reach. Because Celeste Duval had not come to Brookhaven to buy land. She had come to kill 11 men.
The first death occurred on July 19, 1872, during the worst heat wave anyone in Lincoln County could remember. The air itself seemed to rot that week, thick, unmoving, and stinking of sweat and magnolia. Thomas Broussard's body was discovered by his wife at dawn. He lay in their bed at the plantation house he'd inherited from his father, his throat opened from ear to ear. The cut was so deep that his head had nearly separated from his shoulders. The sheets were drenched in blood. It soaked through the mattress and pooled across the floorboards. And yet, Broussard's face looked strangely serene. His eyes were closed. His lips rested in a faint smile. It was as if he had drifted peacefully to sleep, unaware that his life had been taken. His wife's screams brought the servants running. Among them was an elderly woman named Esther, who had worked for the family since before the war. First as a slave, now as a paid maid, though nothing in her life had truly changed except the words people used. Years later, in testimony that never appeared in official records, Esther would say there was more to that scene than just blood. There were 2 empty wine glasses on the bedside table. The room smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something sweet and human that she could not name. She noticed the disarray of the bed, the way the sheets clung to Broussard's bare legs, the unmistakable signs of passion before death. And she noticed something else, a single long dark hair caught in a splinter of the floorboards near the bed, too fine to belong to Mrs. Broussard. She said nothing. She burned the sheets as her mistress ordered. She scrubbed the floor and washed away the blood, the sweat, and the secrets. And when the other servants whispered questions, she told them only what would keep them safe, that Mr. Broussard had been killed by an intruder and that the sheriff was investigating. But outside the Broussard plantation, the truth began to circulate through the freedmen's quarters. Whispers of the new widow in town, the beautiful woman at the hotel who'd caught the eye of every white man with power. Whispers of how Thomas Broussard had been seen visiting her suite at twilight, always alone, always smiling, and how just days later he'd been found with his throat cut. Sheriff Claude Devereaux arrived within the hour, along with Dr. Hebert. They examined the scene, questioned the staff, and quickly constructed a story that satisfied everyone who needed satisfying. The murderer, they said, was a colored man, a thief perhaps, or a freedman with a grudge. Someone who had crept in during the night and slit Broussard's throat in his sleep. Nothing stolen, nothing disturbed, just vengeance. That explanation comforted the white citizens of Brookhaven because it fit their world. It confirmed what they already believed. But the freedmen of Lincoln County knew better. They whispered another name, La Veuve Noire, the Black Widow. And though none of them dared to say her name in public, her story spread in secret gatherings, in hushed tones after church, between mothers and daughters who had lost too much to the night riders. They said she was killing the killers. They said she was taking back what the law refused to touch.
3 weeks later, there was another funeral. Anthony Laird, the attorney, was found dead in his bachelor's quarters above his law office. Same wound, same eerie stillness, same faint scent of lavender. 2 empty glasses again, and the same quiet, contented expression on the dead man's face. This time even the Knights couldn't pretend it was coincidence. They met that evening in the back room of Jessup's hotel, the same dim space where they had planned 100 acts of intimidation and cruelty. Now they gathered there, in fear. Jessup himself poured whiskey with a shaking hand. "It's a message," he muttered. "Somebody's coming for us." Dr. Hebert sat rigidly, his face pale. "Don't be absurd," he said. "These are isolated murders. Nothing ties them together." "Except," said Judge Vincent Theo, "the fact that both men belonged to this council, that both were found in their beds, their throats cut. No sign of forced entry. You think that's coincidence?" They fell silent, each remembering his own private visits to Madame Duval's room, her perfume, her smile, the way she had looked at them with a promise that was never quite fulfilled. None of them spoke her name. Not yet. Outside, thunder rolled over the horizon. Inside, the air seemed to press down, thick with guilt and heat. It was Dr. Hebert who broke the silence. "You're all chasing ghosts," he said. "Whatever's happening, it isn't that woman. I saw her at Mass just last Sunday." "She's in mourning," Jessup said softly. "Always wearing black. Always alone. You think she doesn't know how to hide blood beneath silk?" A few of them laughed, uneasily, but no one felt any safer. That night, the whispers in the colored section grew louder. People said the Black Widow had struck again. They said 2 dead was just the beginning. By the time the sun rose, she had become a legend, a spirit, an avenger, a shadow that moved where the law refused to go. And though no one could prove her existence, everyone, white or black, began locking their doors at night. The third killing came not long after. August 27th, a Sunday morning so heavy with heat that the air barely stirred. Dr. Raymond Hebert failed to appear for Mass. His assistant found him sprawled across his examination table, his throat cut with surgical precision. Next to the body, a folded scrap of paper had been pinned to his shirt with one of his own medical needles. 2 words, written in elegant handwriting. "Remember Natchez." The remaining knights recognized the reference immediately. In the spring of 1868, a freedman named Marcus Baudreau had been lynched outside Natchez for insulting a white woman. The woman had never been named, and Dr. Hebert, then serving as coroner county, had testified that the death was self-inflicted, that the man had hung himself in a fit of shame. Everyone in town knew that was a lie. And now, someone had remembered. Judge Theo called an emergency meeting. "This can't continue," he said, his voice quivering. "We're being hunted." Sheriff Devereaux nodded grimly. "Whoever she is, she knows our routines, she knows our secrets, and she means to kill us all." He didn't have to say her name. They all knew who he meant. Celeste Duval. "She's clever," Jessup said. "She played us all for fools. If we move against her publicly, we'll look like cowards chasing ghosts. We'll look guilty." "Then we handle it quietly," said Marcus Thibodeau, the newspaper editor, whose ink-stained hands trembled as he poured another drink. "The same way we've handled other problems." A cold silence followed. It was the same logic they had used when dealing with freedmen who spoke out of turn. The same justification for every unmarked grave along the riverbank. Kill quietly. Bury deeper. Pretend it never happened. They all agreed. But in the colored section of town, a young housemaid named Marie, who worked at the hotel, had been clearing dishes in the hallway outside that very room. Through the thin wooden walls, she heard every word. That night, Marie slipped away through the dark streets toward the Freedmen's Church behind the rail yard, a place where no white man dared enter after sundown. She told them what she heard, that the Knights planned to kill Madame Duval before she could kill again. The preacher, an old man named Isaiah Turner, nodded gravely. "Then the time's come," he said. "We've been waiting for this moment since the war ended." He sent a message, carried by a barefoot boy, to the Brookhaven Hotel. A single line written in charcoal on brown paper. "They mean to strike tonight." Celeste Duval read it at her desk by candlelight. And then, for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Because this was what she had wanted all along. The Knights thought they were hunting her. They had no idea she had been hunting them.
By dawn the next morning, the woman calling herself Celeste Duval had vanished from the Brookhaven Hotel. The desk clerk told anyone who asked that she'd settled her bill, packed her belongings into a single trunk, and left on the noon steamboat bound for Vicksburg. He even swore he'd seen her board it, veiled, silent, dignified as ever. But the truth was that the woman on that steamboat wasn't Celeste Duval at all. Her name was Charlotte, a freedwoman from Natchez who bore a faint resemblance to her. The real Celeste, if that had ever been her name, never left Lincoln County. She'd moved quietly into the colored section of town, into a small house behind the Freedmen's Church, where she was welcomed not as a stranger, but as something else entirely. An Avenger. For the freedmen and women who gathered there, she was living proof that justice, real justice, not the kind that came from a white courthouse, was possible. They called her La Veuve Noire, the Black Widow. They prayed for her safety, even as they knew more blood would come. And more blood did come. 2 weeks after she disappeared, Eugene Fontenot was found dead in his wagon on the road between Brookhaven and his home. His throat had been cut while he sat beside his horse. The animal had kept walking, calm and unbothered, until a farmer found the wagon at dawn. Pinned to Fontenot's coat was a small note written in the same elegant hand as before. "Remember the fire." Everyone in Brookhaven knew what that meant. 3 years earlier, in 1869, 3 freedmen had opened a small dry goods store that competed with Fontenot's. A week later, it burned to the ground. The freedmen vanished, their families too frightened to stay in town. No one had ever been charged. Now Fontenot had been found on the same road he'd once ridden to gloat over that fire. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Philip Rousseau, the banker, was found at his desk in the Brookhaven Savings and Loan, his throat slit, his account books soaked in blood. The note on his chest read, "Remember the farmer's note." It was a cruel reference to a freedman named Isaiah Parker, no relation to the preacher, who had lost his farm when Rousseau foreclosed on his loan after a single missed payment. Isaiah's wife and children had starved that winter. Rousseau called it just business.
Now, business had found him. By the time the 4th man died, the pattern was clear to everyone in Lincoln County. Someone was killing the Knights of the White Magnolia, one by one, with a precision and patience that bordered on supernatural. And though no one could prove it, everyone whispered the same name, the Black Widow. Even the Clarion Ledger in Jackson printed a small column about the Brookhaven murders, noting the victims' connections but concluding that no reliable witness or evidence has emerged to identify the perpetrator. That was true. No one was willing to speak to white authorities. But in the black quarters, the silence meant something different. It wasn't fear. It was solidarity. When the federal marshal arrived from Vicksburg, a man named Samuel Holbrook, a Union veteran with a scar across his cheek, he found a town paralyzed by rumor and dread. He began by interviewing the surviving knights, though few were willing to cooperate. Jessup, Thibodeau, Devereaux, Judge Theo, all of them denied knowing anything useful. But Holbrook wasn't a fool. He visited the freedmen's church, the rail yard, the river docks. He spoke with old women and young men, with deacons and field hands, offering protection, promising fairness. Slowly, piece by piece, he began to understand the pattern. Every murdered man had a history of violence. Every note referenced a crime the local courts had ignored. And every witness, no matter how frightened, told the same story when the conversation turned to the mysterious widow. She weren't alone. You think one woman could do all that? Nah, mister. That's all of us. She's the hand, but we the arm. Holbrook looked at him sharply. You mean there's more than one killer? The man only smiled. You think justice comes from one person? No, sir. Justice comes from a people tired of waiting.
By September, Brookhaven had turned into a fortress. The surviving knights, Jessup, Judge Theo, Sheriff Devereaux, Thibodeau, William Duplantis, and Charles Arsenault, traveled in groups, carried pistols even to church, and hired former soldiers as guards. They ate behind locked doors, slept in shifts, and jumped at every sound. But the killings didn't stop. William Duplantis was next. He died on October 1st, in broad daylight. His guards stood just outside his study door, hearing nothing, seeing nothing, until they found him slumped at his desk, a fountain of blood spreading across his papers. A note pinned to his sleeve read, "Remember Christmas." Everyone knew what that meant, too. In December 1868, Duplantis had led a night raid on a freedmen's settlement 10 miles outside town. 5 men were killed, 3 women assaulted, their cabins burned to the ground. No one had ever been punished. Until now. The knights were down to 5. Sheriff Devereaux, Judge Theo, Henry Jessup, Marcus Thibodeau, and Charles Arsenault. They met that night in the jailhouse, the only place with iron bars on every window. "She's taunting us," Jessup said, pacing. "Leaving these notes, she wants us to know why." "And she's mad," Devereaux spat. "No sane person kills like this." "Mad?" Thibodeau laughed bitterly. "You call her mad because she's doing to us what we've done to others for years? Maybe she's just better at it." The others glared at him, but none argued. The judge sat back rubbing his temples. "Gentlemen, listen to me. We're making this worse. Every move we make feeds her legend. Every death gives her power. We have to end this quietly before Washington intervenes." "Washington already has," Devereaux replied. "The marshal's here." "Then we'll feed him a story he can swallow. A transient criminal, some mad woman. Then we put this to rest ourselves." Jessup looked up. "You mean kill her?" The judge didn't answer. He didn't need to. They all knew what came next. But Marie, the hotel maid, overheard again. She'd been ordered to fetch whiskey and food for the meeting and lingered outside the jail corridor long enough to catch the important parts. That same night, she slipped through the alleys toward the little house behind the church. Celeste was waiting, sitting at a small table with her journal open, the lamplight catching the curve of her cheek. "They've decided," Maria whispered. "They mean to kill you." Celeste nodded. "Good," she said softly. "That means the time has come." She closed the journal, stood, and began packing the few things she owned: her knife, her notes, a bottle of chloroform, and a small, worn photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a proud smile. It was her mother, Sarah Boudreau, the woman who had been murdered in 1868 after testifying against the men who burned her home. For 4 years, Celeste had planned every detail, every seduction, every death. And now, as she looked out through the cracked window at the sleeping town, she whispered to the darkness, as if her mother could still hear her. "Almost done, Mama. Just 4 left." Outside, the church bell tolled midnight. The hunt was far from over.
The plan took shape with a quiet thoroughness that matched the rest of their work. It was not the reckless fury of a mob, but the sober, careful distance of people who knew what they were doing and had long memories. In the little house behind the Freedmen's Church, Celeste, Josephine, sat with Isaiah Turner, Marie, Charlotte, and 3 others who had lost fathers, sisters, sons. They moved like conspirators, planning a modest, terrible ceremony rather than a crime. There were maps spread across the table, ragged edges lit by a single oil lamp. They marked doors, windows, guard rotations, every nook the knights might have thought secure. They spoke in low voices, each instruction a soft cadence of inevitability. Isaiah had spent his life building trust. Now he used it to coordinate lookouts and messengers. Marie would be the ear in the hotel, the one who could tell them when a meeting ran late, when a guard had moved, what whiskey had been poured. Charlotte had practiced the steps of the deception. Step into a steamboat, wear the widow's veil, put the town at ease that the phantom had departed. 2 men, one nimble and small, another broad-shouldered and steady, would smuggle themselves into the courthouse basement the afternoon before, hiding under crates of rejected county records until midnight. If anyone asked why they were there, they would present themselves as laborers, workers brought by the judge for repairs. The coal chute had been the smallest of details when they first examined the courthouse, dismissed by white men as an old, pointless relic of an earlier heating system. It was the sort of thing no one thought about, but Isaiah had loved that sort of thing. He remembered the layout when he'd worked as a carpenter years before the war. The coal chute was narrow, scarcely wider than a grown man's shoulders, its grate usually bolted shut and forgotten. But the bolts were old, fouled by rust and neglect. With a little oil, a little patience, someone could remove the cover and slide inside the building like a ghost under the floor. That was the plan. It was the smallest entry to the greatest chamber. They rehearsed silently. They considered every contingency, from a guard turning too soon to a dog barking in the yard. Celeste listened, her face like a carved mask, and took no tobacco, no comfort, only the map and the photograph of her mother folded small enough to fit in her palm. When they were done, they prayed. Not for survival. Everyone knew better than to ask for that. They prayed that the names would be remembered and that the ledger of wrongs would finally bear a signature. Isaiah told them what to sing for the night, hymns that would carry through the square and let the guards know people were there. But they would not come to fight, they would come to witness. The morning the knights declared they would fortify themselves in the courthouse, the colored section of Brookhaven was a hive of careful movement. Men hidden under wagons, women watching from porches, children sent for messages. No one wanted to spill the plan into the open, where the wrong ears might pick up pieces. Celeste spent the day appearing to prepare for departure. She made a neat meal of bread and preserved meat. She mended a worn glove. She called for the hotel clerk to arrange her trunk to be taken to the dock. People saw what they expected to see: a refined widow wrapping up her affairs and leaving a town she had tired of. At noon, a veiled woman did board the steamboat. She was Charlotte, with a scarf wrapped in such a way that her profile matched Celeste's. She dipped a hand into her sleeve to touch the polished brass rail and kept a black fan over her face when acquaintances offered a last bow.
The clerk waved from the dock, pleased with his story. But as the boat eased away from the wharf, the real woman who had been called La Veuve Noire slipped into the narrow back streets and into the little house behind the church. She did not go alone. Two men who had earlier crept into the courthouse basement, hiding there by day among the stacks and boxes, emerged as if they were parish laborers returning from their tasks, loaded with the pretense of repair. They unfastened the coal grate with the same quiet patience Celeste had shown in so many other things. A cloth to muffle the rasp, a few soft turns of a wrench, and the iron slid aside. It was small enough to carry alone, but just wide enough to crawl through. She felt the cool, stale air of the chute on her face, the grit of coal dust under fingernails she had kept clean for nights of pretending. There was a humility to that movement, a humiliation somehow, but she let it be a part of the ritual. When she slid into the narrow darkness, she thought of her mother, Sarah Boudreau, who had testified in a court that refused to listen and had been killed for her courage. The image of her mother's face steadied her hands. She crawled, stooped, feeling along the rough iron and brick until she dropped into the courthouse basement that smelled of old paper and stale ink. The men who had helped were waiting, faces dim in the sulky light. One of them handed her a small bag, the knife, the chloroform cloth, 4 folded notes already written and sealed. She tucked the photograph against her heart and began the slow ascent to the first floor. They moved without haste, because haste makes noise. They moved like a funeral, inevitable steps, careful hands, a solemn respect for the dead. Upstairs, the courthouse wore its night like a cloak, lamplight behind curtained windows, shadows confused and heavy. The guards were posted where guards always are, framed by the main doors and ready for force from the outside. They did not think about the coal chute beneath their boots. They did not think anyone would dismantle the familiar and crawl through the old forgotten entry. Celeste found the stair that led from the basement into a clerk's small office that opened into the main chamber. She paused there to breathe and set the bag upon the floor. Outside, in the square, songs began to rise low at first, then fuller, like wind gathering storm. Voices, women's, men's, even children's, wove old hymns with new fervor. They had been instructed to gather and sing a certain number of stanzas at midnight. They were not there to attack. They were there to witness, to make certain that whatever happened inside would be seen by a town that had watched so much injustice and then pretended it never occurred.
Celeste waited while the songs drifted through the floorboards and the guards strained their ears outward. Inside, she let her eyes adjust to the dimness. She unknotted the handkerchief and let a breath of air move over chloroform, as if rehearsing a lullaby. It would be a tool if needed. It was not necessary to think too much about what it might do to a man. She rehearsed the list in her head, the names, the dates, the crimes, so that when the moment came, she would not stumble. She was not a murderer of opportunity. She was an archivist of wrongs, a ledger keeper balancing accounts. The map in her head was precise. Which floorboard creaked near the judge's bench, which passage gave the faintest echo, when the guard rotated his post during the hour before dawn, because men's habits always betray them. She had watched them for weeks. She had learned their small tics, their private comforts, the way Jessup liked his whiskey warmed, and how the judge smoothed his papers between nervous fingers. She listened for the cadence of a footstep that indicated a man had eased into sleep. She practiced patience like a form of prayer. At 2 a.m, when the town songs reached a thick, aching chorus, she took the clerk's door and moved into the hall. For a heartbeat, the world stopped, the kind of silence that precedes something large and irreversible. The courtrooms were designed for public life, for argument and testimony. At night they felt exposed, too open, and Celeste felt the irony.
Here sat men who had made themselves immune to law in daylight. At night, they were vulnerable on the stage they had believed would protect them. She opened the interior door and saw them. 4 men in a circle of lamplight, the judge's bench a block of shadow behind them, Jessup swaying slightly from drink, Thibodeau rubbing his hands, Devereaux looking out the window as if the threat would arrive through the street, the judge pretending to read papers. The guards by the doors had their rifles angled outward, as if the enemy would come from beyond. They could not see her at first. She stood in the doorway like a dark question, and for a moment, just a breath, they could not name what they saw. Then a light shifted. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said. Her voice was low, steady. The accent washed out into something like plain speech. The sudden sound of a woman's voice broke the spell. Pistols came up, rifles trotted toward her, the room tightened like a fist. They had the advantage of numbers and steel, but she had something more dangerous: inevitability. She stepped forward into the lamplight, folded her hands, and smiled. And in that smile there was no victory and no regret, only the precise calm of a person who had kept an account for too long and now sought to close it.
The men froze. The sheriff's pistol trembled just slightly as his hand steadied the sight. Judge Theo's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. Jessup's glass slid from his fingers and broke against the floor, the dark whiskey spreading over the boards. For a heartbeat, no one moved. "Don't," Celeste said softly, almost kindly. "If you fire, they'll come running, and you don't want them to see this." The sheriff's jaw clenched. "Who the hell are you?" "You already know." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the hymn rose again, "Nearer, my God, to thee." The sound floated through the open transom, pure and solemn. The guard shifted uneasily. They couldn't see who was singing, just the silhouettes of people gathered in the square, holding candles that flickered like a swarm of fireflies. Judge Theo found his voice at last. "You've murdered good men, madam. You'll hang for it." Celeste smiled, a small, weary thing. "Good men?" she repeated. "Thomas Broussard, Anthony Laird, Dr. Hebert. Tell me, Your Honor, how many of their victims did you sentence?" The judge stood abruptly. "This is nonsense. Devereaux, arrest her." The sheriff raised his revolver. "Drop the bag," he barked. She didn't. Instead, she reached inside it slowly, deliberately, and withdrew a folded piece of paper. She tossed it onto the desk before him. "Read it," she said. He hesitated, then snatched it up. The handwriting was clean and elegant, the same as on every note found on every corpse. "Remember redemption." Devereaux frowned. "What does this supposed to mean?" "It's what you said to the men you hanged outside Natchez before you burned their bodies. Remember, redemption." "I remember, Sheriff." His face went white. "Those were traitors, murderers, every one." Celeste stepped closer, the knife hidden in her sleeve, glinting just once as lamplight caught the steel. "No," she said. "They were my family." Jessup tried to speak, but no sound came out. The sheriff lifted his gun again, his voice breaking. "You stay right there," she said. "I told you not to." What happened next would later be described in whispers, none of it recorded, none of it proven, only carried in the breath of those who claimed to know. Some said the sheriff fired first, and the bullet missed her, shattering a lamp. Some said she moved faster than reason, the knife catching the light as it crossed the air. Others said the guards heard a scream and burst in only to find blood pooling across the floor. But what is known, what even the Marshal Holbrook would later confirm, is that by dawn, 4 men lay dead in the courthouse, their throats opened as precisely as all the rest. The 5th, Judge Theo, was still alive when Holbrook arrived. He was sitting in his chair staring at nothing, blood seeping through his fingers where he tried to hold his neck together. When the Marshal asked who did it, he whispered, "One word."
widow. Then he died. The courthouse became a tomb. The guards who had survived swore they'd seen her vanish into the stairwell as if swallowed by the walls. No one could explain how she'd escaped. The coal grate was found open, the iron bolts slick with oil. Outside, the townspeople had scattered when the shots rang out, but many stayed near enough to see a small figure in black slip into the alleys behind the church, carrying something that gleamed under the moonlight. By morning, federal troops from Vicksburg had arrived. They cordoned off the courthouse, posted sentries, and arrested half a dozen freedmen on suspicion of aiding and abetting. Holbrook intervened and released them all, muttering that this was no ordinary killer. "She's not hiding in their houses," he told his men. "She's hiding in their history." That afternoon, Holbrook found Marie, the hotel maid, standing by the river. She was watching a small shape drift downstream, a black parasol carried by the current. "You knew her," he said quietly. Marie didn't look at him. "We all did." "Where is she now?" "She's gone." "Gone where?" Marie turned her head just enough for him to see the faintest smile. "Where they can't follow." Holbrook sighed. "I understand I can't just let this go." "Then don't," she said. "Write your report, file your papers, say what makes you sleep at night. But if you ever find her, if by some miracle you bring her back, you tell her the songs still rise on Sunday." Weeks passed. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves. The courthouse reopened, though few entered it without unease. Federal officers combed the woods, the bayous, the river towns. They questioned every ferryman and farmer. They even offered a reward, $500 in gold for information leading to her arrest. No one claimed it. The widow had disappeared as completely as if she'd never existed.
But the legend refused to die. Every few months, another rumor spread. A plantation owner found dead in Alabama, a former Confederate officer slain in Georgia. Always the same method, the same faint scent of lavender, the same folded note with a single phrase: "Remember Natchez." The pattern never reached the newspapers, but the whispers traveled farther than the Mississippi itself. Among freedmen communities, the Black Widow became something more than a woman. She was an idea, the embodiment of justice denied, the invisible hand that could not be shackled. Mothers told her story to daughters. Preachers wove her vengeance into sermons hidden beneath the rhythm of Scripture. In white towns, she was a ghost story meant to keep men awake. In black homes, she was a prayer. Marshal Holbrook retired 2 years later. He kept one item from the investigation: the folded note found on the judge's body. It was smudged with blood, but the handwriting remained elegant. He locked it in a box and never spoke of it again until one night in 1881, when he found himself in New Orleans, sitting in a tavern near the docks. A storm rolled through the Gulf, drumming against the windows. He was drinking quietly when a woman in black entered, her veil drawn low. She ordered a whiskey, her voice calm, faintly accented. Holbrook turned to look, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then she smiled, the faintest smile. "You've aged, Marshal." He felt his pulse slow, then quicken. "You?" She nodded. "You shouldn't be afraid. I'm done." "Done?" "The rivers washed enough blood." "Where have you been all these years?" "Everywhere," she said simply. "Why tell me this now?" "Because stories die when no one remembers them. You're a man who writes reports. Write this one right." He hesitated. "How does it end?" Her eyes met his own through the veil. "It ends when they stop singing." She finished her drink, left a coin on the counter, and walked back into the rain.
Holbrook never saw her again. But sometimes, on humid nights along the Mississippi, he swore he could still smell lavender on the wind. And somewhere, deep in the delta, an old church bell tolled once, soft, distant, and final.
In the months that followed, Mississippi pretended to heal. The papers in Jackson and Vicksburg printed their usual lies, tales of bandits and political assassins, of Negro conspiracies designed to terrorize respectable citizens. Each article ended the same way, insisting that peace had been restored, that order reigned once more. But peace is a language written by those who survive it. In Lincoln County, every white man carried a pistol for the rest of his days. The sound of a woman's laugh in the street could make them flinch. And when the scent of lavender drifted through the air from the flowers that grew wild along the riverbanks, some swore they could taste iron, a reminder of blood. The Freedmen's Church grew crowded that year. On Sundays, people came not only to pray, but to whisper about her, about the woman who had given them something the law would not. They didn't call her Celeste or Josephine anymore. They didn't even call her widow. They called her Justice. In sermons, Isaiah Turner never spoke her name. He didn't need to. When he lifted his voice to say, "The Lord remembers," the congregation answered, "And so do we." The white papers mocked them for superstition. The federal marshals stopped investigating. The new governor, eager to court peace, ordered the case archived. And just like that, 11 names of murdered Klansmen were erased from official memory, written off as accidents or acts of God. But stories don't die that easily in Mississippi. Years later, the legend began to travel beyond the county lines. In the lumber camps near Natchez, workers told stories around fires of a woman in black who moved like a shadow. In Alabama, freedmen leaving the state to join new settlements claimed to have seen her near the river, blessing them with the words, "Stay righteous, stay ready." Children grew up believing she was a spirit sent to protect them. Mothers warned their sons not to become cruel because the widow still walked at night. And somewhere, far downriver, the woman herself was still alive. In the spring of 1885, a traveling photographer named Eli Carter was working along the Gulf Coast, taking portraits of sailors and their families. He was a nervous, talkative man who never forgot a face. In a letter to his sister, he described a curious encounter at a small boarding house in Biloxi. He was preparing his equipment when the door opened and a woman entered. She wore mourning black despite the heat. Her hair, streaked with silver, was hidden under a wide-brim hat. She asked for a picture, Carter wrote. Said she wanted to send it north to a friend. Paid in gold coin, no haggling. When I took the photo, she looked straight into the lens, steady as stone. No trembling, no vanity, just calm. Afterwards, she told me to burn the glass plate. I said that would ruin the image. She smiled and said, "That's the idea." Carter claimed he burned it as she asked, but he kept a copy of the print, which survived long enough to be found in an attic trunk decades later. The handwriting on the back, delicate and slanted, read, "For the record, I lived." By the turn of the century, the story of the Black Widow split into two versions. The white version called her a criminal, a witch, a seductress. They said she lured men into sin and murder, that she was proof the freed people were unfit for liberty. Ministers preached about her as a warning, a parable of what happens when women forget their place. The black version was different. They said she was a mother who refused to weep quietly. They said she had balanced the books of heaven before her time. They said she had come and gone like judgment itself.
By 1905, her name appeared in a short pamphlet published by a radical preacher in Chicago titled The Spirit of the Widow. It told of a woman who walked through the fire of hatred and left no ashes. The pamphlet sold quietly among freedmen's descendants, passed hand to hand in church basements and railway cars. The authorities banned it, of course. That only made it live longer. Marshall Holbrook, retired and nearly blind by then, read that pamphlet one winter evening by lamplight. He was living in a boarding room above a hardware store in St. Louis. The paper trembled in his hands. He had kept her secret for more than 30 years, never speaking her name again. But now, reading the words, he could almost hear her voice. Low, measured, certain. When he reached the final page, he found a line that froze him. She told a man once, "It ends when they stop singing." He closed the pamphlet slowly. There was no way the writer could have known that phrase. He had never written it down, never told another soul. So either the story had lived through some hidden witness, or she herself had written it. Holbrook stared at the wall for a long time. Then he smiled faintly and whispered, "You got your ending, ma'am." He died that night in his sleep. Decades passed. The South changed its clothes, but not its soul. Jim Crow rose where chains had fallen. White historians rewrote Reconstruction as a tragedy for Southern honor. In their books, the Black Widow was dismissed as a rumor, an invention of Negro folklore, one professor called her in 1917. But in small towns and churchyards, her legend deepened. When men in hoods rode again, burning crosses instead of torches, some nights they found strange things waiting. A knife pinned to a barn door, a letter written in elegant script, a single sprig of lavender laid on a windowsill. Sometimes that was enough, because even ghosts can cast long shadows. In 1932, a Works Progress Administration writer interviewed a 96-year-old woman named Marie Baptiste in Brookhaven. The recording survives, scratchy, brittle, but clear enough to catch her voice. The interviewer asked if she remembered the killings. Marie laughed softly. "Child, I remember everything. The songs, the fear, the night the courthouse went quiet." Interviewer asked, "Was she real?" Marie paused a long time before answering. "She was as real as what they did to us. That's all the real you need." Interviewer pressed again, "What happened to her?" Marie sighed. "She lived long enough to see the river wash clean. That's all any of us can hope for." Then she hummed something low, a few bars of an old hymn, "Nearer, my God, to thee." And the recording ended there, with her humming and the faint sound of a church bell tolling in the distance. By the time the 20th century began to crumble into the next, no one alive could remember her face. But the story endured. In songs sung by field hands, in poems written by black soldiers overseas, in the whispered prayers of women who'd lost sons to the night. They said the widow's spirit moved through generations, changing names, changing faces, but always returning whenever justice was denied. Sometimes she was a nurse in a war. Sometimes a mother in a courthouse. Sometimes a young girl walking home alone, but unafraid. Always, she carried the scent of lavender. Always, she left no witnesses.
A century later, the world had changed its uniforms, but not its fears. The roads through southern Mississippi were paved now, the old plantations replaced by subdivisions, and cotton fields turned to soybean farms. The courthouse in Brookhaven had been restored, its bricks scrubbed clean, its wooden floors polished to a shine. Tourists passed through sometimes, curious about Civil War relics, about Southern heritage, about a past that smelled of magnolia and denial. A small bronze plaque by the entrance listed the names of Reconstruction officials who had served there. It did not mention the 11 men who died in that building in 1872. It did not mention the woman who had made them bleed. History had turned her into a rumor again. But rumors, like rivers, never stop moving. In 1978, a group of local historians petitioned to open sealed county files from the Reconstruction period. Inside one box, they found brittle papers stamped "Closed by order of the court, 1873. Most were routine: tax ledgers, property disputes, militia rosters. But at the very bottom, pressed flat between 2 pages of an old legal transcript, was a folded note. The ink was brown with age, the handwriting delicate, unmistakably feminine. "Remember Natchez." The curator who found it never said how it got there. Some believed it was planted. Others swore it was authentic. Either way, it drew attention. Newspapers ran a small piece under the headline, "Mysterious Note Found in Old Courthouse File." No one connected it to the legend of the Black Widow, at least not publicly. But in the quiet corners of Brookhaven, the whispers began again. Old folks who remembered their grandmother's songs said softly, "She's still here." That same summer, a retired schoolteacher named Clara Holmes, who taught history at Jackson State, began collecting oral stories from elderly black residents across Mississippi. She carried a tape recorder and a worn notebook bound in leather. Her goal was simple: to capture memories before they disappeared. When she reached Lincoln County, an old man in his 90s, nearly blind, told her a story she'd never heard before. He said when he was a boy, his mother used to take him to the edge of the river at dusk. She'd tell him to listen, not for frogs or crickets, but for the faint sound of humming that drifted over the water. "She said that's her," the old man whispered, "the lady who made the men pay. She never left the river. When you hear her humming, it means somebody somewhere got what they deserved." Clara asked what the woman's name was. He smiled, toothless but proud. "She ain't got one. Not anymore. She's every name they took from us." That night, Clara sat in her car on the levee, watching the moon float on the slow black water. And though she told herself it was the wind in the cane fields, she swore she heard a low melody, the same tune that had drifted through that courthouse 100 years before. "Nearer, my God, to thee." She wrote in her notebook, "The Black Widow is not a woman. She is the memory of justice denied." Over the decades that followed, her story took new forms. Filmmakers turned her into a tragic anti-hero in black lace. Poets reimagined her as a whispering guardian. Activists in the 1960s wore lavender pins to protests, claiming it was for her. Each retelling changed her face, but never her purpose. Some said she was a monster. Others said she was a saint. But every version began and ended the same way. With the night, 11 men died in their beds, and 1 woman walked free. Even now, 150 years later, locals still tell newcomers about strange things near the old courthouse. A shadow glimpsed in the upstairs window long after the building closes. The smell of lavender in the dead of winter. The faint echo of a woman's voice singing through the vents when the air is still. No one ever sees her clearly, but the janitor who works the night shift swears that when he locks the doors, he sometimes finds a single black glove lying on the steps, always the same one, always dry no matter how heavy the rain. He never touches it. He just whispers, "Evenin', ma'am," and walks on. There's a saying in Brookhaven now, carved into a wooden bench behind the church where the freedmen once sang. Justice wears no mask, but she still walks at night. No one knows who carved it. But some nights, when the air is thick and still, and the moon turns the river silver, people say they can see her reflection there, a woman in black, her eyes calm, her hands clean, her expression neither angry nor kind. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to, because every story told in secret, every wrong remembered, every name whispered back into history keeps her alive. And though the world has changed, though her victims have turned to dust and her witnesses to legend, one truth remains: the Black Widow never vanished. She simply learned to wait. And somewhere in Mississippi, when justice sleeps too long, when cruelty finds a new disguise, she stirs again, silent, patient, eternal, humming the same soft hymn that once drifted through the courthouse in 1872. Nearer, my God, to thee, and the wind carries it down the river like a promise.